Good morning and welcome back to another episode of the Red Chip Poker Podcast. My name is James Sweeney, aka Split Suit. Coach Weasel is going to be leading today's conversation all about bet sizing, and I want to let you know if you want even more on bet sizing, I would highly suggest signing up for Pro and checking out the complete bet sizing course we have in there. There are 15 videos in there, very in-depth content, and everything you need to take your bet sizing game to a more technical and advanced level. This is applicable for any player, whether you're a cash game player or a tournament player, live or online. Bet sizing is the name of the game if you're playing no limit. Sign up for Pro today by going to redchippoker.com/membership. Again, redchippoker.com/membership. Sign up, get in, and on the Pro dashboard, you'll find a link to the course. No problem, super easy to find it. Again, if you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to kick it over to Coach Weasel for today's episode. Enjoy.
What is up, guys? Welcome to the Red Chip Poker Podcast. This is Coach Weasel, and the topic of this podcast is the fast sizing framework. The objective here is to give you a framework for thinking about how to size your bets in every situation. We have a unique problem in 2022, which is, let's say, for example, someone posts a hand on the forum, the sizing doesn't look quite right, the hand looks like it's been misplayed, so another player offers to run that hand through a solver, and they get back to us with the surprising result that the solver does actually take this line some of the time. In fact, if you add up the frequency, it's maybe something like 0.43% of the time the solver takes this exact same line. So what should be our conclusion in that situation? Should it be, okay, the solver does take that line, albeit with an extremely low frequency, so my play is correct, nice hand? Or should our conclusion be, the solver hardly ever takes that line, the best line is probably the higher frequency line that the solver is taking? Now, the true answer is somewhere in the middle, because in solver land, where we're playing a perfectly balanced game, all of the different lines a hand can take will have the same EV. And in solver land, the hand should be mixed into those different lines because they provide an important balance function. In real life, though, there's a good chance that if a solver is taking one line at a 99% frequency with a certain combo and another line with a 1% frequency, we should generally just convert that information into a principle and say, okay, this type of hand likes to do this option, i.e. the higher frequency option, and then basically just ignore the really low frequency option and consider that to be a mistake if we actually take that line, even though the solver technically approves of that line with an extremely low frequency. And that's really what this sizing framework episode of the Red Chip podcast is about. We're going to be talking about the highest frequency things that you should be doing. In other words, the principles that govern your day-to-day sizing selection strategy. So let's start off with strong value hands. How should we be sizing our strong value hands? And the general principle here is to bet large with value hands. Now, that might sound like a no-brainer, but you're probably aware that a lot of players are using small sizings with strong-made hands with a fairly high frequency. So, for example, if you just take the simplified c-bet range on the flop for 1/3 pot, which is a strategy that has really permeated a lot of online games, there are many players making use of such a strategy. Well, think about that. If they're betting their entire range for 1/3 pot, inside that betting range, there must be some very strong value hands. And those strong value hands are not necessarily maximizing their EV by betting at that small bet sizing. So the principle here is that strong value hands should generally bet large. Now, of course, we can run a solver model and we can point out all of the situations where strong hands do bet large a lot, but they're mixed into the smaller bet sizing range. We're not ignoring that. We're just saying as a general principle, when we have a strong value hand, we want to grow the pot as much as possible. And in most cases, we achieve that by using a large sizing. Now, if we just think about another theory concept that involves perfectly polarized ranges, the idea here is that we want to bet an equal proportion of the pot on each street to get our stack in smoothly by the river. This mathematically should result in the highest EV for our range. Now, that's an ideal world where ranges are perfectly polarized, and there's one thing we know about flop and turn play, it's that ranges are rarely perfectly polarized on the earlier streets. So we'll find that the strongest value hands still might be outdrawn by the river. We find that even some of the weakest bluffs might outdraw our opponent's bluff catches by the river. So there's not really such a thing as perfect polarization on any street before the river. So how does that affect our outlook in terms of should we still be looking to use a linear sizing structure if ranges are not perfectly polarized? So we can make use of two different plans. We can make use of a plan that has an early street heavy sizing plan. So we bet larger on the earlier streets, larger percentages of the pot, but a smaller percentage of the pot on the later streets. And we can also do the opposite, which we can refer to as a later street heavy sizing plan, where we start off with small sizings on the flop, but then we increase the sizing as we go throughout the hand, so we have our largest bet sizings on the river. So in a situation where we have a very strong value hand, let's imagine it's extremely vulnerable to being outdrawn. So let's say we have something like second set, and let's just say it's the effective nuts at that moment in time, but there's quite a number of flush draws and straight draws out there directly on the flop, although nothing's completed at this stage. Well, rather than make use of a linear bet sizing structure, that's the kind of scenario where an early street heavy sizing plan might make a lot of sense. Now, the opposite scenario is a situation where we have everything completely locked up. So, for example, we flop top quads on the ace deuce texture. There's just not really a lot of hands that our opponent is going to be able to pair us off with. Besides, we find in those kind of situations that we have a blocking effect on our opponent's continuing range. Now, we don't really care too much about blocking effects on the flop, but in a situation, for example, where the texture's fairly dry and we hold top set, that card removal effect will be noticeable in that situation. We will notice that we get more folds directly on the flop when we hold top set on a dry texture, because typically a decent amount of our opponent's continuing range is going to be top pair type hands, and our opponent simply has way less of those since we have them blocked. So the general summary here is try and bet as large as possible with strong made hands, and that includes overbets. Typical situation, for example, is single raised pot 100 big blinds, heads up. We usually have to make a small overbet on the flop to get the chips in smoothly by the river if we were following a linear sizing structure. So if it's a situation where our value hand is extremely vulnerable, that should tell us we should seriously be considering sizing such as 1.5x pot on the flop, so we can have that early street heavy sizing plan. On the flip side, it might be okay if you have a very non-vulnerable, unlikely to be outdrawn value hand. It may be okay to actually start off by using that hand as part of a smaller bet sizing range. So a simple example is we have pocket kings on the king 7-2. It may be okay to bet small on the flop, but then drastically size up on the turn and river. So that's going to be a later street heavy sizing plan. And we will find the solver does mix generally anyway. So even in a situation where we have a strong value hand and the spot is not completely locked up, so let's say, for example, we have second set, there are some draws out there. What we might find is the solver has some of those second set hands in a small bet sizing range and some of them in a larger bet sizing range. But if we have a principled understanding of what's happening in that situation, we'll be able to say, actually, I'm not going to use that hand in the small bet sizing range whatsoever. I know the solver mixes, but the reason why the solver mixes is it's assuming that villain is so good that if we don't protect that smaller bet sizing range with our strong made hands, then that's something that can be exploited. But assuming that it's not going to be exploited, and this is true in 99% of cases, our opponent's not going to be good enough to exploit us if we're not accurately protecting that smaller bet sizing range. Well, in that situation, we're just burning money by betting smaller with our strong value hands when we could be betting larger and growing the pot. So key to making use of these bet sizing principles is understanding what happens in theory and why what we want to do is slightly different. And another theory concept we can draw on here as well is board texture. There are some board textures where we are supposed to bet fairly large, or at least have a large bet sizing range. For example, if we are the PFR and the board texture comes down 2 Broadway cards, for example, something like a king, queen, 5, we are supposed to have an overbetting range. It's just theoretically correct to do that in a single raise heads up pot as the PFR. Whereas if the board texture comes down monotone or paired, we'll see that we're mostly supposed to use small sizings anyway. So what constitutes a large bet sizing? That can be related to the texture to some extent. So a large bet sizing on a monotone texture might be 80% pot, for example, whereas a large bet sizing on a king, queen, 5 might be 180% pot, as an example. Let's move on to the next category of hands, which we'll refer to as thin value. And this is really an extension of the next category of hands we'll look at as well, which we'll refer to as medium strength hands. So thin value, medium strength, they're kind of just opposite ends of the same spectrum. Basically, we have a made hand, it's not super strong. In some cases, it might be strong enough to extract value, but it's not ultra strong. So how do we play this type of hand in terms of bet sizing? One of the questions we want to look at is how robust our made hand is. Now, robust means something fairly specific, and it refers to the vulnerability of a hand. So something is considered to be robust if it's unlikely to be outdrawn if it were to be checked down. Whereas something, if it's not robust, if it's vulnerable, it means it's likely to be outdrawn. Now, depending on where we classify our hand on this spectrum between robust and vulnerable, it gets its value from slightly different places. So when we have something that's very robust, it gets its value from being called by villain. So a hand's unlikely to be outdrawn. We don't mind if our opponent calls, because if he does, he's probably not going to outdraw us anyway. So in terms of our perspective, it's more valuable for our opponent to call than it is to fold, because basically that's just free money most of the time when our opponent calls, since he's probably not going to outdraw us. In some cases, this might mean that we can slightly reduce the sizing to encourage calls. Whereas there is another category of thin value hands, which actually gets most of its value from fold equity. So that's an important concept to wrap your head around. Just because we are value betting, it doesn't mean we necessarily want calls. Let's say we have something that's fairly strong as far as thin value hands go. So not super strong, but we could still expect reasonably to be a favorite against our opponent's calling range. But there are a huge amount of cards that can outdraw us on the next street. Now, if you run the EV on that spot, we often find that it's more profitable for us if our opponent folds. It's still profitable if he calls, and obviously the overall EV, irrespective of whether our opponent calls or folds, is going to be positive. That's the most important thing, because we can't control whether our opponent calls or folds. But if someone said to us in that moment of time after we make our thin value bet with our vulnerable made hand, would you like your opponent to fold and we'll award you the entire pot? Or would you like your opponent to call and you will be an equity favorite against his calling range? Now, we might think to ourselves, well, if we're an equity favorite against his calling range, then that must be the best option, right? Because we're increasing our EV. No, not necessarily. It depends on a range of factors, but let's just say this category of hand, we often end up performing better if our opponent folds and we win the entire pot directly. You know, really simple example. Imagine there's $1 million in the pot and you make a $1 value bet. If your opponent folds, you win $1 million. But let's say he calls, you're a 51% equity favorite. Well, yeah, you're making 51% of that extra dollar technically, but you're also kind of losing 49% of that $1 million that's in the middle. So just with a simple thought experiment, we can see that actually, if our opponent were to fold directly, that's going to be even more profitable for us. And of course, that's kind of a ridiculous example, because why would you bet $1 into a $1 million pot? But that also just illustrates that bet sizing plays a factor in this issue. Depending on the sizing we use, it might be better for us to get folds than calls. Now, the key takeaway here is that when we're betting a thin value hand, we may often benefit more from the fold equity than from the equity we have when our opponent calls. We prefer folds. And this is sometimes an argument for slightly increasing the sizing. That may decrease the pot equity we have when called, but it folds out a larger amount of our opponent's equity share. And remember, we're benefiting most from the fold equity. What this means is we may sometimes bet larger with slightly weaker made hands, because those weaker made hands get most of their value from the fold equity or equity denial. Simple example could be we open the button, big blind defends, we get something like a king-9 deuce texture. If we have pocket threes, we might actually use a larger c-bet sizing than some type of 9x hand, because the 9x holding is fairly robust, whereas the pocket threes, well, it's borderline whether we should refer to that as a thin value hand, but we could get called by some worse. Either way, it's a lot more vulnerable. We don't necessarily want our opponent to call when we have pocket threes on the king-9 deuce, because pretty much everything he has is going to have at least 2 overcards against us. So we'd prefer to fold out his equity share. Now what we'll see with the solver is that there's a decent amount of mixing that goes on here. So we see that some of the robust value hands may bet at a slightly larger bet sizing range. We may find that some of the vulnerable type stuff bets at a smaller bet sizing range. And again, these are all balance considerations. And we can ignore those for the most part. Unless we think our opponent is very, very good, we can just size individual holdings at that ideal bet sizing and ignore the fact that the solver mixes. We can understand why the solver mixes, but that doesn't mean we need to do this when thinking about basic bet sizing principles. So next time you have this kind of thin value hand, think about where the value comes from. Does it come from getting called, or does it come from the equity denial? If it comes from the equity denial, why not try sizing up slightly and seeing what kind of results you get? Now the next category is the mid-strength, and this is very similar to thin value, although we're kind of assuming that these hands are a little bit weaker on average and they won't necessarily be an equity favorite if they get called after we bet. Once again, we're interested in the vulnerability or robustness of these holdings, because if we have a mid-strength hand, but it's unlikely to be outdrawn, a lot of the time we should just check. Or if we do bet, it's probably going to be in a fairly small bet sizing range. However, if we have a mid-strength hand, but it's vulnerable, then we should generally be looking to bet. And we could also think about sizing up slightly to capitalize on equity denial. So you can see this is very similar to the previous category. It's just that now we're not necessarily going to be an equity favorite when called. But that should tell us we don't need to be an equity favorite when called for this to be a good idea. We can protect a made hand even if we expect to be an underdog against our opponent's calling range. Because remember, where does the main value in betting come from? Well, it's not from getting called by a whole bunch of worse hands. The main value comes from equity denial. It's true that if we bet really small, we could increase our chances of getting called by a range that has less than 50% equity against us, but that's not necessarily the best thing to do. Again, remember our thought experiment. That's maybe kind of like betting $1 into the $1 million pot. Yes, we are an equity favorite when called, but now our opponent has a huge percent chance to actually win the entire pot. So it actually ends up being bad for us in the long run. We prefer to bet slightly larger. We'll have even less equity when getting called, but a decent percentage of the time we'll take down the entire pot and fold out our opponent's equity share. Once again, there's a lot of mixing that goes on here. For example, one thing that the solver might do is it might deliberately bet with a hand that's fairly robust and non-vulnerable, and it's doing that with the intention of using it to protect a range on a later street. So a really simple example of this, imagine with a PFR, we open the button, big blind defense, we c-bet a non-vulnerable made hand. So for example, board text is something like King, Queen, 5, and we have something like Queen, Jack. Now I'd recommend if you have Queen, Jack on the King, Queen, 5, you just check back 100% of the time because it's a non-vulnerable made hand. But the solver's going to c-bet it some of the time. And one of the reasons is if we c-bet that hand, after the turn goes check, check, we can now use that hand as a bluff catcher against a river probe bet. So we see that non-vulnerable hands do get mixed around because we want to protect every part of the game tree, ideally not just specific parts of the game tree. So we understand why the solver mixes and how it works. We may even have some basic mixing in our own strategy, but unless your opponent's really good, it's not that important. If we just checked all of the non-vulnerable hands and bet all of the vulnerable hands in a certain situation, we'd be doing very well. We just wouldn't be balanced like the solver is, but maybe that's not really a problem against most opponents. The next category of hands is semi-bluffs. Really simple recommended principle here for semi-bluffs. Try and size your bluff based on the strength of the semi-bluff. So that means that backdoor equity is going to use small sizings, gut shots slightly larger, especially if they're nut gut shots, flush draws and OESDs even larger, so flush draws possibly the largest. And if we compare, for example, a 5-high flush draw to an ace-high flush draw, the ace-high flush draw is going to use a much larger bet sizing range. Again, you can kind of plug this into a solver and say, hold on, the solver's betting large with some very weak draws and it's betting small with some very strong draws, so shouldn't we be doing that? It's okay to understand why the solver does that. It doesn't mean it's necessarily a good bet sizing principle to draw on. For the most part, we can follow a really simple principle here, and that is if we have a strong draw that's very likely to make the nuts by the river, we want to build the pot as much as possible earlier on in the hand so that if we hit, we can get a big payout on the river. Whereas if we have something that is very likely to make a dominated main hand by the river, so think low end of the straight, baby flush completed on the river, then we don't necessarily want to put ourselves in an all-in scenario for the river. Those can be some of the most awkward situations you find yourself in. We take the low end of the straight or a baby flush draw, we play hyper aggressively on the flop and turn, trying to get our opponent to fold. We then hit on the river and we think, okay, we've reached the river, but our draw is really not that strong after we've hit. Let's make a small bet or let's check. And then villain shoves all in. Now you're in a difficult situation. Theory-wise, it might be a fairly straightforward call, but what if our opponent doesn't have any bluffs in that spot? Maybe we should be hero folding with that dominated draw. It's a really awkward situation. The good news is you don't need to be in that situation, because if you always keep the pot small when you have a dominated draw, but grow the pot when you have a nut draw, you're always going to be in the perfect situation. If you're dominated, it's going to be a small pot. It's usually going to be easy to get to showdown. If you have the nuts, then it's not going to be too difficult to get the rest of the chips in, because ideally you'll have an SPR of less than 1 for the river anyway, so it's fairly easy to get a big payout. Now, why doesn't the solver like this? Well, if you just think about that kind of strategy, that means that anytime we're making big bets or raises on the flop and turn, our range is going to be overly strong. It's not going to be balanced. It's going to have a whole bunch of strong draws and it's going to have a whole bunch of value hands. And a good player is going to be able to exploit that by overfolding. So what does a solver do? It basically mixes in very trashy hands in order to make sure that that bet sizing range is not overly strong. So it plays hyper aggressively with things like dominated gut shots and backdoor equity and weak pairs. We understand why the solver does that. It doesn't mean that we should necessarily be doing that in our games. We shouldn't necessarily be using this as one of our bet sizing principles. Against the vast majority of opponents, if we're dominated, we want to limit the size of the pot rather than grow it. So again, we understand what the solver's doing. We have this option to completely ignore that. On the flip side, we know that our smaller bet sizing ranges and our checking ranges might end up being weaker than they should be. That's exactly why the solver is going to bet small with some very strong draws. And also, as we've seen, bet small with some very strong made hands. Again, we understand why the solver has to do this, because the solver has to play a balanced poker, right? It's assuming that its opponent is a perfect GTO opponent. We know our opponents are not perfect GTO opponents. So we can once again disregard this specific principle and focus on a more important overriding principle, which is to limit the size of the pot when we have a dominated hand. Finally, let's think about our last category, which is air. The basic rule with air is to bluff fairly small if it's a good bluff spot. So part of this is understanding in which situations it's going to be good to bluff on average versus a typical player pool. There are some spots where we could just fire all of our air, and there are other situations where we shouldn't really be firing with air because our opponents are simply not folding enough according to the data. So it may take a bit of work to figure out where all the good bluff spots are. But notice we've said bluff small if it's a good bluff spot, and that's simply because if we have air, it means we don't really have any equity. So if we are c-betting the flop with air, there's no real valid reason to use very large sizing because we're not looking to build the pot. We know why the solver might sometimes use a large sizing there to make sure that the large sizing range is sufficiently weak and not exploitable, but we probably don't care about that. So if it's a situation where it's not a good bluff spot and we have complete air, then we could just give up. We don't need to be bluffing in that situation. We don't care if our betting range is overly strong and doesn't contain enough garbage. Only the solver cares about that. If you explore some solver models, you'll eventually come across situations where the solver is overbetting either the flop or turn with a complete airball. And again, we understand why GTO might require that. We also hopefully understand why it doesn't necessarily apply to us. We don't need to do that unless our opponent's very good. Even if our opponent is very good, we may only need to do this occasionally with weak hands, rather than go for the full balance strategy, which might involve a considerably larger amount of air that's going to be overbetting on the flop or turn, for example. But this is very hypothetical. I don't really remember the last time that I overbet either the flop or the turn with a complete airball. It's just not necessary. Even if we want to overbet kind of wide, we could at least pick some kind of semi-bluff rather than a complete airball. And again, this is one of those spots where if you overbet a random air combo and then run it through a solver, you may find that the solver approves of your line with a low frequency. So you could look at that and say, well, the solver overbets the king deuce offsuit on this blank turn. So even though it only does it with 0.45% frequency, it's GTO correct. Yeah, it might be GTO correct on a certain model, but it violates all of the bet sizing principles we've spoken about in this podcast episode. So we use solvers to inform our strategy to generate principles, but we're not happy with a line just because a solver takes that line with a very low frequency. Let's just go for a very quick recap of everything if we were to give the 30-second version of bet sizing principles. Strong value hands mostly just bet very large. Think about overbetting. Thin value and medium strength hands bet if they're vulnerable or they can extract value. Otherwise, check. If we're betting because they are vulnerable, we may be able to size up slightly. Semi-bluffs, if it's a strong semi-bluff, use a large sizing. If it's a weak semi-bluff or air, use a small sizing. If it's not a good bluff spot, then we can check with air, and we can also check with our semi-bluff holdings if they are dominated or weak. In other words, if we're the PFR and we flop a dominated gut shot, we don't have to c-bet that just because we've got a gut shot. In some situations, it might be better to c-bet a really good backdoor nutted equity type hand than it would be to c-bet a dominated gut shot, because that gut shot's still going to be dominated even if it hits, whereas at least the backdoor nutted equity might catch a runner nut flush or something like that by the river. So as you're playing, think about these basic bet sizing principles. Try not to get bogged down too much with all of the mixing that we see if we run a solver model. And if you can stick to these basic principles, you're going to do very well in the vast majority of spots with your chosen sizing. Thanks very much for listening, guys. This was Coach Weasel, and this was the Red Chip Poker Podcast.